Hey guys, welcome to this week's Money and Investing Show. This week we are talking with the rather difficult topic of life planning and more importantly, how dynamic your financial plan needs to be to help you traverse some of the expected surprises that come along and then the more sinister, unexpected ones. Having a plan is crucial for that. It's going to give you certainty in what can be an incredibly uncertain world. Make sure you take plenty of notes, but as always, make sure you take plenty of action. Hey guys, welcome to this week's Money and Investing Show with me, your host, Andrew Baxter, and as always, my offsider and co-host, Mitch Olarenshaw.
Dynamic suit, that one, AB, which ties in very nicely with today's episode, believe it or not, because we are going to talk about the dynamics of life planning. Yet again, under the financial planning series of episodes that we have, albeit one of the most important ones, I would say.
Certainly is, and this whole notion of having a plan for anything in life, whether it's your goals for your in personal life or in business or whatever it might be, you have to have a very, very clear set of objectives. Any road will take you nowhere. I guess the biggest challenge, like anything in life, there are always setbacks. And so you need to bring some flexibility to where your goals are. You need to be absolutely steadfast and resolute on what they are and the determination to get there. But you have to be incredibly flexible on the pathway that you take to get there, because there are always bumps in the road that potentially could knock you off course. And I guess financial planning, and particularly the dynamics of financial planning, is a particularly important thing to acknowledge. You may have a great plan, but is it life-proofed?
For sure. And I know anyone listening to this, whether you're accumulating wealth, transitioning to retirement, or you are retired, will get plenty of benefit out of this. Probably the best place to start, though, AB, as I know we always harp on about, because it's true, is working out what exactly that you want and your goals.
Yeah, I guess, in this conversation, Mitch, it's going to bring together a lot of the things that we've talked over previous weeks about. And it's a really neat little structure that you've given us there in terms of that accumulation, transition, and then I guess what financial planners call the drawdown stage. They're typically the three stages of a financial plan. And each one of them carries its own series of challenges with it in terms of action steps that you need to take, I guess landmines you need to avoid treading on. And most importantly, an acute awareness that the best laid plans in the world can get blown out of the water. And so, if you've had a setback or something that's blown you off course, that's expected. And it may be something that you didn't expect. It could be, a force majeure or something that's completely out of left field. But setbacks are expected. We just don't know what particular wrapping paper they're going to come in. And I guess we'll explore some of the particular scheduled ones that most people come across, and maybe one or two of the ones that are definitely left field, and they can be harder to deal with. Things that are expected, you can have a game plan for, but when it comes out of left field, that can be more challenging. But if you're expecting something to come out of left field and you don't know what it is, at least you're kind of on the front foot. You're in a better position than someone's a deer in the headlights, sort of, why has this happened? I don't understand. And they sort of get paralyzed with fear for the next 5 years working it out.
Not a good place to be. And I know that if you know what you want, you've got some goals and some plans around that, as you say, it's going to significantly affect what that course of action might look like. For example, if you are accumulating wealth, which is probably the best place for us to start here, AB, what does that look like, that accumulation of wealth stage?
The accumulation phase, you're probably just starting your career, either out of school or out of uni. If it's out of uni, you may have some HECS debt that you're chipping away at. As you know, HECS debt's actually not a bad debt insofar as, it doesn't carry interest for a start. It's more inflation related, although at the moment with inflation moving higher, it's a little bit more punishing. And that focus of getting all the core skills that we've talked of previously, that emergency funding, that 3 months of funding there, and really starting on a defined savings plan where you've got a budget that you're adhering to, all of the core skills are then going to set you up. And as you transition through that, starting with, getting into the workforce, one of the early things that come across might be the opportunity to buy your first property. Now, a lot of people sort of will look at that and go, it's out of my reach. It's out of everyone's reach when you're young and starting, because you haven't probably accumulated a deposit and you haven't accumulated the savings habit of being able to service debt. So this is an intergenerational issue. It's not something that's true for today's in any way, shape or form. Than it was different from my parents or indeed my grandparents. It's a challenge, that affordability. And it becomes an increasing challenge because, as we're often told, property only goes up in value over time. It doubles every 7 years, as the ad often says.
They do say that, yeah.
Whether that's the case or not is immaterial. The bottom line is it does go up in value. So the later you leave it to get started, the higher price of admission you have to pay. So bottom line, very simply, is get started, get your first property as quickly as is humanly possible.
I actually saw the other day the average age in Australia for a first home buyer is 36 years old. It's a lot older than what I thought.
That surprises me. It does surprise me an awful lot, actually. I don't know if that's something that's changed more recently, where it's moved higher due to perceived affordability issues. I look at my wife. She was 21, I think, when she bought her first property. And that wasn't because she was born with a silver spoon in her mouth. She just set the intention that she wanted to own a property. And as she started working, she worked very, very quickly toward that. Matter of fact, it was just sold probably about 4 months ago. So it's been a cracking investment for her and her family, because her sisters had the benefit of it as well. And
Great.
On it goes. And at 20, that's an enormous milestone to tick off. I was a little behind, although I was living in London, so it was a little bit more expensive to do that. And I think I was 23, maybe 20. I think 23 or 24. I think when I got my first property.
Still pretty young though.
And in central London too. So yeah.
Yeah. Gotcha.
And you're across the line too, and
21 for me.
And the reality is, the sooner you can get cracking on it, the better, because you've got that asset there working for you. It also means that your money that you're earning is funneling into servicing a mortgage, as opposed to giving you the ability to have some discretion over it. So that first and foremost milestone, getting that property under your belt. For many people in a traditional sense, and I guess some of the things I might say might seem a little bit antiquated and traditional, but that's the lens that we look through at tradition, and then you can take your derivative or variation from that. Perhaps moving in with a partner and eventually getting married is the next phase. Pooling money, pooling assets, that's a huge step for many, many people. And I think the older you get, the harder that is to probably do. And that notion of having joint bank accounts and buying properties together and all those sorts of things can be really quite confronting. And so having a team money plan is crucial. It's one of the reasons we talk about date night. So both of you are on the same page, that together collectively you're working towards a common goal. And so that's a big one. Then along come kids.
That's a big thing to plan for, right?
It's enormous to plan for, and it's a biblical expense. For many, many households, in that it's not just having children, it then goes through the next phase. Your overall bills become higher because of food consumption. I certainly look at my lad at the moment who's 7, and it's like a wood chipper. I can't put enough food in the boy. He's
a new motorbike.
Just got a new motorbike, so he's pretty happy about that. Yeah,
awesome.
So he's going along pretty well. So you put your ongoing costs. And this is why budgeting is such an important fundamental task. These are things you can plan for. You're having a family, so you start to save up for things like a cot and car seats, or maybe you've got to change the type of car you have so you can accommodate your kids. It may be that you've got to move home from maybe the bachelor pad, which may have been the first place that you had, which it was certainly my case, and move into more of a family style home and go from there. So there are costs associated with that, particularly if you have a larger family. And then moving through that spectrum, I've got 5 kids, so you think about clothing, think about dentists, think about all the consumption, food, all of those things, and then you potentially then have school fees if it's important for you to put your kids through a private school.
So can I just stop you there, AB? Because listening to this, there is so much to plan for. How many kids are you going to have? How expensive are they going to be? What clothes do they wear? Gender, everything that you need for them. How in the hell do you plan for this?
Make a lot of money, and I think that's a really good question. Sometimes, of course, children can be unplanned, and that can really be an external shock to your financial plan. I think we were initially planning on, I always thought 2. Well, I always said before I got married I'd have 4 kids. Then after I got married, I thought 2's good, and then we had 3, and now we're blessed to have 5.
You figured out what's causing it yet?
Worked out what's causing it.
Quality problem to have.
It's anyway, let's not go down that rabbit hole. It's good leisure activity. And the bottom line at the end of the day then is schooling. A lot of people put emphasis on, they want to send their kids to a private school. You may be looking at 30, 40 grand a year per child. Obviously it's after tax, so you need to make sure that you're in a position where you can squirrel away that cash to really do it. And there's a trade-off. So the kids going to private school or buying an investment property or properties, which is the best solution to what your goals are? And I think this can be very, very confronting as a parent, because you want to give your kids the best opportunity that you can. And oftentimes social pressures can push you into making decisions that aren't necessarily consistent with that. So my wife and I went through this. Neither of us went to, I went to a really rough school in the UK. I got stabbed at school. It was a rough school.
Holy smokes.
And my wife went to a good school. It wasn't a private school. It was a state school where both of her parents were teachers, funny enough. And so neither of us were from a private school background, but at one phase we had two of our kids at a private school prior to moving because we felt that was the thing that we needed to do. We're in a position to afford it. And on reflection, it wasn't the right call because it didn't suit either of our children's personality at that particular time. And I've seen them thrive, particularly so in their current schooling. So that social pressure of, okay, you're affluent, so your kids should go to a private school and you can network with other like-minded parents and the doors open and all that sort of stuff. Quite frankly, that's not something at this particular point in time, as a truly honest answer, I stack an enormous amount of value on, having seen how it is and where my kids are right now in a state school.
Gotcha.
So that can be a real millstone for a lot of parents, and it is a very, very expensive pathway to then take. And then post-schooling, there's the possibility for university, and if you've got cash, they're not going to get that much help out of the government for it. You're going to have to underwrite a lot of that. So it's being able to forward plan, and I guess that's the key thing with all of this is that you need to have a plan for how you're going to fund this, because you can't earn enough working to support those kinds of expenses comfortably unless you're on a particularly high level of salary. So you have to get investing early, maybe prior to the kids or even at the early stage with the kids, so that well that you dig early on has got the ability to be drawn for water in 5 or 8 or 10 years time or 20 years time as you need it. Dig the well before you need the water, as the saying goes.
So with this, AB, when you talk of planning, does this mean sitting down with the financial planner years in advance and saying, we're thinking of having kids at this age, buying this many properties, sending them to this school in every little detail so that you can start to develop a plan from there?
That's sort of a pretty anal and very intricate plan to put down. But if that's what you've put down on paper, if you fall short of that, that's okay, because you've set the benchmark really high versus, we'll just rub through life and see what curveball it throws at us and we'll deal with it as it comes along. And it's like anything in life, Mitch, and if you're in the reactionary mode, and just to give you a really simple example in our space, in the trading space, this is why we have our clients write down and adhere to a trading plan so that when unforeseen events happen, they've got an immediate course of action they've planned for, as opposed to what's the vibe on the day for doing it. Because those sort of seat of pants decisions are very reactionary and they tend not to be so good. So even though it seems exaggerated to sit down with your advisor and say, look, we're planning on having maybe 2 or 3 kids over the next 5 or 8 years. You don't know when you're going to fall pregnant, if you're blessed enough to be able to have children, etc. But you can start the work early and go, well, if that's your plan, then maybe now is the time for you to be doing X, Y, and Z, so that if what you're aiming for comes true, financially you're in a position whereby, you've been able to use the cash you've got today. Because you got the cash today, you'll find a way of spending it. Better off getting it invested so it grows. And I guess the whole point to this particular narrative is you can't save your way to financial success in any way. You can't earn enough money to cover those expenses. You have to get your money working for you. So that's why getting invested early is so critically important.
And I from the sound of our conversation, it sounds as though this accumulation of wealth is arguably the longest phase out of the 3, I would say.
It is effectively, because you've got to, don't forget, we're just talking about having a family at this point in time. Kids have finished uni, maybe they might get married. I've got 4 daughters.
Oh, true.
So, I've got the potential, I'll be pretty good at father of the bride speeches, I reckon, by the time we're all said and done. But, if you're old school and you go, well, you're going to pay for the wedding, these are all things that you need to maybe consider within a plan, so that as and when those expenses come along, you're in a position where you can deal with them, which is extremely important. And we've only just focused on some narrow family stuff here. These are all things that you go, wait, how can you plan for all that? Well, quite simply, you have to start getting your wealth accumulating by getting it invested. So a nice portfolio of shares or exchange traded funds, or a property or 2 or 3, and contributing to your super, so you're getting that tax benefit from it, and it's growing now, ready for your retirement down the line, are all examples of strategies that are going to help you accumulate wealth, so that by the time you need that money, either through retirement or as events come along, it's not an external shock that blows you off course and sends you into a panic and go, we have no ability to deal with this.
Speaking of which, external shocks. Now, accumulation of wealth, we just said, is the longest phase. So it's likely that if one of these are going to occur, it's going to occur in this phase here.
Biggest time window for it, for sure.
External shocks, so things like getting an inheritance, what else? I mean, some other divorce, something like
divorce,
that.
litigation, is a whole ton of stuff. And some of them can be positive. So, having an inheritance, and right now we're in a situation, in our economy, and in fact, I think it would be fair to say this for pretty much most of the Western world, where arguably the biggest transfer of wealth is going to occur as the baby boomers start to pass their wealth on to the next generation. And this is an enormous thing. And you think about if your parents have got a house and you're going to inherit that, that's $1 million, $2 million at least in the current economy that we're in.
Baseline, yeah.
Which is a huge injection of wealth for many, many people. And in some instances, it can be, significantly more than that. Some people less. The bottom line is that what you do with that money when it comes in, you can't bank on receiving it. You might have a blue with your parents and they might decide that, the dog's home probably needs it better than you do. But if you are inheriting something like that, you've got to have a plan for what you're going to do with it. And again, financial legacy and financial literacy is something that's, driven me pretty hard over the last 20 plus years in my career, where I think there's a responsibility that comes alongside money, that if you leave your kids money, that's one thing. But if you leave them a set of skills to be able to prudently steward and manage that money, it's not this one-off injection of cash, let's go on holiday and have a great time, or get the house paid down or upgrade the car. It's something you can actually turn into significantly more than that with the right level of skill. So an external shock like that, whether it's planned or you've got aged parents, is something that you can then add into your plan to say, okay, as and when we inherit that, then we're going to do this and that with it. I know when my mother passed away, my father and I have got some investments together, courtesy of my mum, and we've got a plan for what we're doing with it. And it's particularly important with things like in the UK where my dad lives and where his properties are. There are things like inheritance tax, for example, that you've got to really tiptoe around and be very, very careful, and you've got to plan towards those things. So there's an example of an external shock as a positive. Not so good one is you get sued. And you find yourself in court for a period of time. And we've used previous examples to this, where if you're in a high-risk position, we talked about the anaesthetist, I think, is a high-risk profession, where, you could potentially get sued. And if you've taken the steps that we've spoken of to get your asset protection in play and your assets held outside of your name, then that's good. If you haven't, you've got a real problem. And, that could be all-consuming. You've got to maybe you've got to do a drawdown on the property that you live in to fund your legal fees if you don't have directors and office holders insurance, another form of risk management if you're in an exposed position as an executive. These are all things that a good financial plan accommodates and gives you flexibility to be able to deal with. Divorce is a huge one, and particularly when you look at the statistics, which, depending on what stats you look at, I'm always minded of the joke, 99% of statistics are made up. But, the reality is more and more people appear to be getting divorced in terms of as a percentage rate. And let's say it's 50-50, 50% of marriages end in divorce. It's far higher than that, actually, but let's say it's 50%. What happens in the event of divorce? And I've got, one of my best mates has just gone through this, and it's catastrophic for him financially, because he's made some fairly poor decisions on the way through. And I think it could have been resolved in a lot different way than where it's ended up. And, family law is an interesting space. I'll leave that area of expertise to my wife, given the fact that she's a family lawyer. But there are a lot of different things that you can do in there. So if you've gone through the accumulation phase, kids have gone, and then all of a sudden you go, yep, don't love you anymore, and I don't want to be with you, I want to go and do something else and discover myself, or I've met someone, or whatever it might be. How you go about carving up those collective assets that you've worked on is a major shock, but again, doesn't have to be done in a really toxic and bad way. There are ways that you can work through that with some level of planning and maturity to come out of it where, like any good settlement, neither party are happy, but it's not catastrophic and devastating in terms of the fees and acrimonious stuff that goes alongside it. So, that's a huge one. Another one is an injury and an inability to work. And again, it's an external shock. You're happy riding the bike to work one day, getting fit because it's important to have vitality, and you get cleared off your bike by somebody in a car, and fairly seriously hurt. Hopefully that never happens to anybody that's consuming this, but it's a reality of things that can go wrong. And having TPD, total permanent disability insurance, or income protection insurance, can then step in and fill that void. But if you don't have those things and can't work, well, that's a major external shock, because you're definitely out of the accumulation phase now, and you're into the drawdown phase immediately of needing an income to live off from your assets. And so you have to try and check the boxes as much as is humanly possible for all of these things that can come along, and more. We're just talking about a handful of them today, so that your plan can be flexible enough to ensure that you stay on track towards your goal, even in the face of some fairly significant headwind.
There's a lot going on in that accumulation phase.
You have to have an advisor. This isn't something that you can cover in a book. It's not something you can cover in a podcast. This is a dynamic conversation, because your personal circumstance is going to shift almost every time you have that conversation. There's going to be a new thread to people's lives, and a good robust game plan, in this case financial plan, it is going to help with a little bit of left and right sidestepping here and there, keep you moving forward when all of these events come along. So it's a blip in the road rather than the crater that takes you out.
Got you. Let's now change pace, AB, and let's go through that transition to retirement phase.
So assuming you've got to cross the minefield.
Assuming you've got to cross the minefield, you've accumulated some wealth, starting to get older, as you are, and you're transitioning to retirement, be it whatever age that is. What are you looking at doing? What are you planning for?
At that stage, you've got to work out what retirement actually then looks like. And retirement is again in itself is quite a challenging thing for financial planners. And I look at the challenges their guys face when they're helping clients put together a financial plan. The government legislation, for example, is changing a lot and constantly removing the goalposts to different areas. So what does retirement look like? 55, is it 60, is it 65, is it now 67, in terms of an age that you can work to? And given the cost of living for many, many people, they are pushing it further down the line to continue to earn and ensure that they can have a reasonable quality of life. So I think you've got to have a pretty good indication. So one of my good buddies, let's call him Shoes because that's his nickname, great guy, very successful in the investing space. What I admire about Shoes more than anything else, and over the 30-year friendship we've had, is he's a huge planner, like massively so, very, very strategic in terms of playing the long term. And we had this conversation not so long ago in terms of, well, what does retirement look like? We've grown up together, we've worked together, we've had setbacks together and so on. And sounds like a Roman or like a Greek tragedy, this, doesn't it? And we're talking about, what's the next phase? And both read this book by Arthur C. Brooks, great book on the next phase of your life as you transition to retirement to effectively cope with goal setting. When you've gone from being very, very competitive and driven by goals to, okay, well, retirement's the next big goal. What does that need to look like? And it's actually really good having a buddy to bounce that conversation off, because he's not showing any signs of slowing down any more than I am, because we both love what we do. But you still have to think about what retirement looks like, and that may come down to things like what the budget might look like. And if you've got debt, particularly, one of the things that you simply have to do before you can retire is retire your debt. Your ability to service it is no more if you're not earning. And so restructuring a property portfolio, for example, or if you've got investment loans, restructuring those kinds of things are essential steps in there. And I think more than anything, that transition to retirement, putting a human spin on this rather than just simply money and investing, is mentally coming to terms with the fact that you're getting towards the back end of your career. And that is very, very difficult for many people whose identity has always been their career. You meet someone and say, so what are you all about? What's your story? Oh, I'm a teacher, or I'm an accountant, or I'm a doctor. That's their identity. And all of a sudden it's like, that's robbed away from you, and I'm retired.
Yeah, who are you?
Which is great. You get life back for sure. But for a lot of people, I think, it's a huge reshift mentally. This is got nothing to do with money and investing, but the emotional and mental shift. Because what's the next square on the board of life after you've retired? And it's really death. So, it's a little bit of a morose way to think about it.
Yeah,
and so you've got to transition very carefully and go, okay, this is my next chapter and this is what I'm going to be doing. So maybe you do have something that you're going to do part-time. And I've got good buddies that they sit on boards of companies because they are too young to retire mentally. And they've repurposed themselves because they feel they've still got something to do. And it's not necessarily about the money, it's about the purpose. Also, the money doesn't hurt because it delays the drawdown phase, which of course is the next one on there. And this can be at any level. A very good example of this, I won't use names, and I've got to spend a little bit of time with this particular individual, incredibly smart guy, former Supreme Court judge, going to retire at 65. Now, this guy is, no question about it, one of the most intelligent people I've ever had the privilege to be in the company of. Fantastic wine collection too, I might add. One of the best wine collections I've ever seen. Very envious looking at that. Oof. It's like, and he's gone on now to work in mediation because he's not able to sit on the bench anymore. But he's got this enormous tapestry of legal knowledge over 40 odd years of being in the legal profession, and now he works as a mediator, helping fix problems for people based on his experience he's got. So he wasn't ready to put the flag up the mast. I'm sure the money doesn't hurt either, because actually it's surprisingly low salary for a judge. You'd be surprised. It's not as high as you think.
That is surprising.
Must be pretty good enough to buy a decent wine collection, though, as I say. Very envious of that collection he had. A lot of verticals. That's the thing you want to aspire to next.
Okay.
So like a 71, 72, 73, right the way through every year. Very impressive. So going on to forgetting about wine and getting back onto the matter at hand, I guess after transition is that notion of the drawdown phase, retirement. Which is
retirement, right? Okay.
So that's where, effectively your career income has stopped and you're now reliant upon your superannuation and other forms of investment income. And if you've taken the time, almost irrespective of how late you might get to the game, whether you start this in your teens or 20s, which is where you've got yourself to, which is fantastic, or whether you've arrived at the game a little bit later and maybe started this in your 30s, 36, as you say, for the average age for a first-time buyer.
According to Instagram Reels, yes.
Must be true.
Definitely
Bastion of all facts. Or whether it's 40s or wherever it might be that you've gravitated into this vortex of wanting to learn more about money and getting it there. The reality is you've got to then rely on the income from the work that you've done previously. So you're now drawing from the well. Now, my dad's 81, he's still saving, and that's partly because we've done some incredible investing and also partly because of some of the life skill attributes my dad has. He's a great budgeter, always has been, and he's been able to go from literally abject poverty to being in the rarefied atmosphere that he now is. So, it's an interesting thing. A lot of people are concerned, and one of the biggest plans, I think, or one of the biggest problems for planners in today's world is a longevity issue, whereby you may live longer than your money survives in terms of your transition to retirement. And those last few years, when you've worked all your life and you're sort of living in poverty, turning the light off and buying everything that's in the reduced bin at the supermarket, and that's a reality for a lot of people out there, because they've either got a deficiency in the plan that they've had an external shock that they haven't been able to bounce back from. Bankruptcy would be an example of that. The retirement planning just went awry, and it doesn't necessarily have to be your fault. You think about someone that was looking to retire 2 weeks after the GFC. And all of a sudden that investment portfolio that you had is worth 30 or 40% less. And look, there'll be cynics listening to this going, oh, well, poor rich people can't. That's not what this is about. It's the fact that there are events that can go on as an external shock that totally reframe even the best laid plan that you might have had. So you're about to transition into retirement, and all of a sudden your asset pool is worth 30, 40% less. Which means effectively your income potential is probably 30 or 40% lower than what you were budgeting for.
Sure.
So a big setback in that space. And that longevity issue is a huge challenge for financial planners, especially when we've been through a phase, not so much now, but where we've had a lower interest rate and lower return environment for a number of years. The money's not growing as much as it was. The average returns are a little bit lower. So by the time you get to, say, 65, which might be when you want to retire, that pool of asset, which should have been worth, let's say, $1 million, is only worth $850. And again, there'll be people that put up a hate comment about that. We're using that just as an example here. That 150 grand shortfall has a massive impact when you come into retirement in terms of your income. So being able to move the pieces around to suit what's going on in the economy at any given time is key. And just because you've had an investment strategy that's worked particularly well through a certain phase of the economy is not necessarily going to work well for all of your life. So you might have been a property investor and done very, very well with property, as so many people have. If we move into a phase where property prices go into a slump, or the vacancy rate, particularly for things like commercial property, for example, or office space given work from home, or whatever the particular thing may be, heaven knows with artificial intelligence, maybe nobody will ever be going to work again. All that office space is no longer yielding anything. That can have a material impact. So that swing from a low yielding commercial portfolio into a high yielding residential portfolio would be an example of switching within property to a different performing sector. Or maybe if you've been invested in stocks and the market goes through more of a bear market, maybe moving into a bearish exchange traded fund or more conservative utilities or stocks that tend to hold up as well would be a smart move rather than have higher growth stocks. So you need to be able to move your plan around. It needs to be dynamic, and it will be like that for its duration from the day you start it until they're reading your will.
You're always planning ahead. We keep coming back to this in a lot of our episodes, AB. It's the theme of our podcast, planning, having some action in place to make sure it happens for you.
You have to do it, Mitch, and you're right. And this will seem like a broken record, I'm sure, for many people. You have to be thinking ahead, and that's the way to get money working. You can't be Johnny on the spot. We go, okay, we're doing this, and being very reactionary. You've got to have a longer term set of intentions. And I guess just by pointing out some of the things that we have, some of them are obvious life events and some of them are probably not. But having a game plan or something that you can pull out of the kit bag when you need it, rather than then spend, yeah, look, we've had kids that spend a year or two working at what we do next, and you're probably exhausted anyway if you've got a couple of kids. Get that plan in place, so when we have kids, we're going to have to do this instead, or whatever it may be, is going to give you that really fluid transition into a better, more functioning life plan that I guess more than anything is, I think the term would be in step with where your life is. When you sit down initially, as you mentioned, with your planner right at the start, and so this is my perfect plan, it might be like you're dancing to a tune, but the beat's changed. So the dance might be really well executed, but it doesn't fit the music anymore. And you've got to change step and change tempo to match the circumstances in which you're in. And I think financial planning is very much like that, whereby you have to have huge levels of flexibility, and you can't be frightened to make changes either. That fear of what to do. And this is why you need to have great advisors. And I guess more than anything, you need to be your best advisor yourself by learning about these things, so that you're able to receive this information, understand what it means, and take affirmative action on the back of it, rather than go, oh yeah, that was interesting, and it just goes into the bin of memory that you never actually do anything with. It needs to be more than interesting. It needs to be a game plan that you can follow and execute for all the reasons we've talked.
Beautiful. Couldn't have said it better myself, AB. Thanks very much for the advice today.
It's a huge topic, and it's dynamic. And if we did this interview over again next week, I'm sure some of the emphasis points would change, which reflects just how dynamic a financial plan and life plan truly needs to be. It needs to help keep you on the straight and narrow, even when there are bumps in the road. Key thing is plan for the expected, but have contingencies in play for the unexpected, because they'll come along too.
Beautiful. Thanks, AB.
My pleasure. Anytime, Mitch. There you have it, guys. Make sure you like, comment, subscribe. Most importantly, hit the notification button, and we'll look forward to hosting you next week.